Last week I broke down the visual details in Death Stranding, a beautiful new game from Kojima Productions, and one of the best looking games this generation. But due to length restrictions, I wasn't able to go into depth on the base PlayStation 4 versus Pro. Well, today that's coming up and a whole lot more. To do that, I am joined by my good friend and colleague, Richard Ledbetter.
Hey John, how's it all going there? I'm really interested to see how this is all panning out.
Yeah, it's going great. I've been playing a lot of Death Stranding, testing it, and we have some interesting results today. But first, here's a summary of what we've got coming up today. We're going to check out the visuals between base and Pro. We're going to check out the performance with the new patch on both systems. And interestingly enough, we will also be comparing the final game to some of the early trailers shown back in 2016 and 2017 with some interesting findings. So, let's kick off with the comparison with base. And for starters, you've seen the video I've done there, and I think you can agree, this is a beautiful looking game that takes excellent advantage of the Decima engine.
Yeah, it's a landmark release, I think. Just the character rendering just stands out in particular as being on a new level, I think, for this generation. Then, when you factor in the environmental rendering, I mean, Horizon was good, but this takes things to the next level, and the fact that it's still running on current generation hardware. I mean, just before we carry on, let's just remember that the base PlayStation 4 is effectively running a customized Radeon HD 7850.
Yeah, combined with that lovely AMD Jaguar CPU.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, I view this game from a technical perspective as kind of like a celebration of developmental enterprise and how they're able to get so much out of a fixed console architecture, you know, just basically via the experience they get by using the same hardware across a set number of years. I think it's absolutely phenomenal.
And in this case, you know, I mean, Guerrilla had Killzone Shadowfall at launch, and now we have Death Stranding here almost at the end of the generation, and it kind of shows the shift we've seen. And Death Stranding kind of resembles almost photorealism at points, like the material work and just the quality of the models and everything. It's really a new level of visual quality, and really one of the best looking console games of the generation.
Yeah, I agree, but the irony is, of course, that if a third party released Killzone Shadowfall today, we'd probably be raving about it because it still looks awesome. I went back to it a couple of weeks ago and it still looks great.
Yeah, I agree, actually. I've looked at it as well, and especially the sequences in the city, it's still an absolutely stunning looking game. So yeah, I mean, Guerrilla Games, their engine work, really just some of the best in the industry. And that is extremely evident when you look back at the base PlayStation 4. I mean, as you said, this is 2013 hardware, but what we have here is it's very, very close to the PS4 Pro version in every way except for resolution, and that's where you would see the expected difference. So as I said, it's 4K checkerboard on the Pro, very similar to Horizon Zero Dawn, and again, like Horizon Zero Dawn, the base PlayStation 4 version is 1080p.
I guess obviously looking at this, all of the marketing was carried out on PlayStation 4 Pro right since the very first time we saw the game. Didn't see anything on base. And obviously, you know, we've seen a lot of games this generation where the base system is kind of lost pace against the enhanced. So yeah, I was going to be quite interested to see this one.
Yeah, it's nice to see that they've managed to maintain that. It does seem to be sort of a staple for Sony first-party games as well, where they try to hit the highest resolutions possible given the hardware constraints, and that's exactly what we have here. The only thing I should note, though, is I also tested the Pro version for downsampling, and now this is difficult because the anti-aliasing is very, very good, both at 1080p and 4K CBR. So from what I can tell, however, it doesn't look like native downsampling is supported by the game. If you set your Pro to 1080p, it does shimmer more like the base system as opposed to when you downscaling it using, like, say, a capture card. And so if you want to downsample, it seems like you're going to have to use the system level feature, which does introduce a little bit of extra blur, I suppose. So something worth noting.
That's interesting because, well, let's go back to Horizon. They actually had two modes.
That's right.
On the Pro version. The performance mode, which wasn't really performance related. It was all about how far they could push native rendering in terms of resolution, while maintaining an absolutely perfect 30 frames per second. So I'm wondering if that's what they're doing there, whether they're actually forcing that old performance mode at 1080p, whereas if you're at 4K mode, you'll get the checkerboard rendering.
And funny you should mention that because, well, don't want to spoil what's coming up, but yes, I did test that, and there are some benefits as we'll get to soon. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I'm finding, and even at 1080p, image quality is good, but there does appear to be a little bit of extra shimmering, as you might expect. But overall, I feel like this is a great example of how to do multi-platform game development. It's really good on both those consoles, and of course we have the upcoming PC version next year, so which would be even more interesting.
I think so, because if we actually run the PC version at native 4K, you'll be able to actually get a pretty decent representation of Guerrilla checkerboarding versus native rendering, which could be quite enlightening.
Yeah, I'm very eager to check that out. And of course, I should also note that both versions support HDR, which is phenomenal. So yeah, if you have an HDR set, this is a showpiece title. But so as with many games though, Death Stranding has been shown several times in the past, going all the way back to 2016 when it was first revealed in this very strange trailer. And I thought it would be fun to go back and compare these trailers to the final game, seeing as some of these same sequences do still exist. So the first one is interesting because this is the one that looks the most different, I think. And I noticed a few changes. Sam's model was different, for instance. I think Norman Reedus in the final game looks more like Norman Reedus, as opposed to the slightly off-model looking original trailer. Things like hair is improved, the shading is improved, and the environment itself has seen some changes. The distant rock formations in the background have changed. The water appears quite different. It's a little more shimmery in the final, oddly enough, but the actual wave patterns and the water washing up on shore looks more realistic, I think. But, the basic scene is very, very similar, to the point where we were kind of discussing, you think this is really running on Decima?
It's all about Occam's razor, really, which is, basically how plausible this all is. So that the established narrative we have, and it is an awesome story, is that Hideo Kojima went out into the world sampling all of the top game engines after this trailer was created, I believe, and then settled on Decima from Guerrilla Games, and then that was an awesome reveal. But the narrative doesn't really hold up, I don't think. It could do, but what we're seeing here in terms of that initial 2016 teaser is so similar to those final scenes that it does seem highly likely that it was Decima right from the very beginning. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on that. Maybe it's pre-rendered using Decima, but it has a lot of the telltale sort of rendering signatures, and it does look very similar to the final game. And most of the changes, I feel, are more like art tweaks and changes as opposed to a complete revamp of the way everything works. So it does seem to me that this was at least made using Decima, and maybe they tried to create this scene in two different engines. There was the other one they had mentioned, which we're not sure what it was, but it's entirely possible that they had the engineers and artists sort of craft this in both, and then they kind of decided from there. But either way, I do think that this still looks remarkably close to the final game in many ways.
Yeah, and it's kind of borne out when we look at the 2017 asset, which is, well, aside from some art touch-ups, it's identical basically to the final game.
Yeah, so I kind of went through this frame by frame and just sort of analyzing it closely, and I have the trailer here side by side for you, and you can see that it is very similar. Some of the first things you might notice, Sam's suit, for instance, has some different coloring. The shader work on the plastic material is subtly different. If you look closely, you might see that it does seem like there's ever so slightly less rain overall, but it could just be obscured by some of the changes to the filtering, like depth of field is a little stronger in the final game. I also noticed, like, when he's creeping towards his body here, the camera work is different. They actually lower it in the final game, looking more towards the ground. So obviously they went through and sort of with a fine-tooth comb and sort of made tweaks to the actual scene direction. And by the way, you may have noticed in this scene is how I love this about it, but so many of these sequences, they have a camera that doesn't really cut, where it's like one continuous shot. And I love this sort of direction, and it really looks cool in action.
And it's the sort of thing that would be much more difficult for a movie to do.
Yeah, exactly. This shows what you can do with a real-time game engine, and you can just sort of move the camera wherever you want and do some amazing camera work. Also, let's see, as the camera sort of zooms around here, you might notice when the dead body starts to go into the ground, there's a reduction in the particles, or a change. Like the particles in the final game are much more sparkly and more dense and have more of a pattern to it as opposed to the original. That's cool to see. Also, when this guy stands up, you'll notice there's a little light on the BB container that is now lit in the final game that was not in the demo. It's very subtle. And also here, you may notice the vehicle has changed color, so that's interesting. And then Higgs here, when they show him briefly on top of the vehicle, and you'll notice if we pause it that the container with the BB that he's holding, it's now properly sort of illuminated in a way that it was not in the original trailer. Looks better. And then when it actually cuts back to the other guy here, if you look at the BB container there, you'll see that they sort of added more of an atmospheric fog rendering to sort of simulate the depth of the water. You know what I mean? It has that murky look, the whatever liquid is in there. That's far more realistic in the final game. And yeah, I mean, we're getting into nitty gritty stuff here, but I think it kind of gives you an idea. So like at a glance, it looks pretty much the same, but there are a ton of these little tiny subtle changes made throughout the scene, which just shows some of the iterative process. But it's so close at this point that you can tell that, I mean, they had established a visual design. They were up and running on Decima and looking great even at this early stage.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because it is just tiny iterative changes, tweaks. The artists have obviously gone in there and made some changes. But if the original trailer had shipped in the final game, it would have been perfectly fine, really, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
it just
exactly.
goes to show the kind of attention to detail that's now going into these projects.
And even on top of that, when you line up these things in Adobe Premiere, the audio is 100% in sync. All the dialogue points and the music and everything, it's identical, as is the actual animation. So all the motion capture they did for this scene is still in effect. So yeah, I mean, they were getting all this done 2 years ago, and it's pretty much what it is in the final. It's very cool stuff.
Yeah, I also like the way that the initial reveal asset is, essentially retained in the final game. I mean, it kind of speaks to a consistent vision from day one, really, in terms of what this game was going to be and how it was going to be delivered and the kind of the way it was directed. There wasn't any massive wholesale changes from when we first saw the game back in 2016.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the fact that it's been 3.5 years since that E3 reveal trailer, they really... it's very consistent. I mean, this is clearly what they wanted to do, and this is what they have done, and it totally matches that. And it's great to see a case where a game shown so early basically matches what you were initially shown in the final version. And, there's something to be said for that, for they delivering on those promises, and they absolutely did. So
I know we usually go back to look at these trailer versus final game things in order to get some kind of view on how things evolved across the course of development, but it's the consistency here that really impresses me, and I do wonder how much that is down to the fact that we are at the tail end of the console generation now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Technology-wise, we're kind of locked, I would imagine. There's not much more to be got from these machines, so it is just a case of being able to focus more on the vision of the game.
Exactly, and I think, that's what I enjoy about these late generation games. They really shows the artists push things to the absolute limits of the current hardware spec, and then it's time to press the reset button for PlayStation 5 and the next Xbox. So yeah, good stuff. But what it also means, of course, is that amazing character rendering technology was pretty much set in stone in 2016, and we're now at the tail end of 2019. It's quite amazing. Yeah, absolutely. It's really great stuff and very promising for the future. And honestly, I think I mentioned this before, but I'm very eager to see what this experience for Guerrilla will lead to for the next Horizon game, in the sense that we know now that upwards of 70 or so people from Guerrilla Games helped work on Death Stranding, And I assume that whatever, assisting Kojima Productions and working with that team of artists has no doubt helped them understand some new things and maybe change the way they think about certain things. And it seems like a great collaborative effort that will benefit everyone involved, and very eager to see what that brings to the table.
Yeah, I'm going to be sort of following that one with much interest, and I believe that Guerrilla are expanding the studio in the Netherlands there, and bringing on a lot more people. So I suspect we'll see more than just Horizon Zero Dawn 2. And I'm going to be curious to see which project comes first, whether we'll get Horizon 2 first or whether we'll get something else. Hopefully something for launch, because I really do think that Killzone Shadowfall was such a key title for PlayStation 4 in that crucial launch period, and I'd love to see a mega first-party effort, and if it's Guerrilla, awesome.
That would be great, absolutely. But with that out of the way, then, we should also talk about the performance, which is our third pillar for today. And as I noted in the original video, this isn't as interesting as it might seem, in the sense that there isn't a huge amount to talk about, but that's actually a good thing for you. But there are some interesting differences between PS4 and PS4 Pro. And also, as I said, there is a lot to talk about in terms of cutscene versus gameplay, where there is a noticeable difference between the two in terms of how they perform on average.
Yeah, that's interesting. That was one of your key points in the first video, which was that performance in gameplay was pretty awesome, but not perfect. But you could see some very noticeable dips in the cutscenes. But we've got two aspects to this. First of all, we want to compare the base and the Pro. And secondly, we've actually got a new 1.03 patch, which switches things up a bit from when you first looked at the game. Is that right?
It was 1.03 yesterday, but now they're up to 1.04, so I've done some additional tests. And I guess basically 1.02 or so, which is what I tested for last week, still had some performance dips during gameplay. But both 1.03 and 1.04 seemingly fixed a lot of these issues. And as far as I can tell, this kind of stuff has been pretty much smoothed out in the updated version. And I spent hours just wandering the landscape, getting into trouble, just trying to find places where I could dip the frame rate. And I'm sure it's still possible, but the fact that it was so difficult to find anything at all says a lot about the state of the game, in the sense that, the gameplay experience is very, very stable. And for the gameplay side of things, then, this is where we can bring in the PS4 versus PS4 Pro. And the good news here is that both of them deliver a very, very consistent experience across the board during gameplay. It is just as smooth, or stable, I should say, on the Pro as it is on the base. And it feels great to play. Surprisingly low input latency. And it just feels really responsive for a 30 frames per second game.
Good stuff. Well, I mean, I kind of expected this, really, because, as you say, the track record from Sony first-party studios in terms of the base versus the Pro is pretty much established now. And secondly, we do have Horizon Zero Dawn as a really good example of what Decima can do in terms of base versus enhanced. So it's good to tick that one off, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. But then we have the cutscenes, and this is a little bit interesting in the sense that it's clear that Kojima Productions is sort of pushing the limits of the engine with some of the cutscenes. And I guess I should say that in the sense that a lot of the shots they do focus on supreme detail. Like they zoom in very close to something, then they scale out and you see the whole shot. A lot of uninterrupted camera work. It's really impressive stuff that sort of pushes, I guess, the limits of what they can do in the engine. And it is a huge step over what Guerrilla was doing in Horizon with their cinematics. So I assume that this will benefit their engine as well. But needless to say, there are performance dips here, and sometimes in the very strangest sort of situations. So I start here with the introduction sequence running on Pro versus base, and as you can see, they are pretty much lined up perfectly. They dip in exactly the same spots to just about the same degree. Sometimes the Pro has maybe a 1 or 2 frame advantage during these sequences, but overall it's very, very, very similar, which is good. But then there's there are these other scenes, and this kind of crops up throughout the game. Like this one here where you're in your chamber, you can go over and examine the mirror. And for whatever reason, I find that enabling the mirror and looking in there as Norman Reedus really has a strong impact on performance and on both consoles. A lot, actually.
Well, that's interesting. Is it a render to texture thing? Is it literally doubling the whole pipeline at that point?
So what it is I noticed when you go over to the sink, the mirror, it's actually sort of an electronic mirror in the sense that it's sort of, I guess it's not reflective initially. It looks like a metal surface, and then he walks up to it, and they do this cool effect where the mirror opens up and you see a reflection of the room. And based on the quality I'm seeing, it does kind of look as if they're simply doubling the whole image. So it's a very expensive reflection technique for sure, rather than like a low-res take on it. So I can see why it would be expensive. But in these cases, the PS4 base system has an advantage over the Pro. Often 2 to 3 frames, I'd say, during these scenes, and it's just more consistent overall, which I think is probably perhaps a bandwidth issue, which is where the lack of super sampling comes in when selecting 1080p output, because the game does actually render at a lower resolution, and as I kind of expected, that solves all of the performance issues in situations like this. So as you can see here, the Pro runs the mirror section at a pretty much locked frame rate now when you're outputting 1080p. And in fact, when using this mode, it is kind of similar to the Horizon quality mode in the sense that it just sort of locks down performance and it reduces what few dips there are to basically none, which is really nice. But still, I kind of prefer playing at the full resolution for this one.
But I think overall it does seem to be a rerun of Horizon, in that the game basically drops in the same areas on both machines to the same extent. And we actually went to Guerrilla Games and spoke to the developers when we were covering Horizon, and they were basically saying that compute versus bandwidth, the strengths and the weaknesses of both the base and the enhanced machines, they kind of balance out within Decima. So, for example, the Pro has a massive geometry processing advantage over the base unit, and obviously the base unit has a relative bandwidth advantage when you're comparing compute versus bandwidth. So yeah, it kind of balances out overall to the point where you do get very, very similar performance across the board, and it looks like it's just these outliers like the mirror that actually bring about any kind of difference.
Yeah, it's pretty much that. So it's impressive then to see how close the two are and how the resolution scaling works there. It does balance out really nicely. But yeah, I mean, this is why I kind of relegated this to the second video, because as you can see, it's just not that surprising or interesting in terms of raw numbers. And again, that's actually a good thing in this case.
Yeah, we actually had a 20-minute limit on our video, as you can see from the duration of the first video we put out there. So it was a case of prioritizing the most important information. I think the job you did on the first video, which was basically to emphasize on the technological achievement here, it really did the job. And the comparison stuff is kind of secondary in a way, because it's Guerrilla Games' Decima engine evolved to the next level, and it still has many of the same attributes as Horizon did, and that includes performance.
Absolutely. But yeah, that's pretty much it on this one. It's a great looking game. It looks beautiful on both Pro and base PS4. It matches up to those original trailers, and you get that excellent performance all around. So it's a great game visually, and for me at least, gameplay-wise as well, even though, as expected, it is remarkably divisive. But I am a fan of this brand of weirdness, and more accurately, I really enjoy the sort of traversal stuff and what they've done there. I feel like they've really taken a stab at solving the open-world traversal issues that we've faced in the past, by spicing things up and actually making you pay attention to managing your balance, weight, and everything on the way from point A to point B, rather than just pointing in a direction and going, which is cool. So
yeah. I mean, one thing I'd like to just say is that I haven't played the game yet. I mean, I've been following your progress over the last few weeks with much interest, but I haven't played the game yet. I don't know if I'm going to like it, and if I don't like it, That's absolutely fine. You know, the fact that it exists doesn't offend me in the slightest. If it, you know, because we need that kind of diversity in games. Not everything should be the same. And what I like about it is that there was a sense of mystery, of enigma around it, all the way up to the reveal of all the way up to the embargo last week. But even now, until I go hands-on with it, I don't know really what I'm going to be getting. And I think that is a rare and precious commodity in games, and we should be celebrating that. You know, just the fact that it's out there, and the fact that Sony were prepared to back a vision that was totally different from everything else out there. And I think, to be honest, I have some issues with Kojima games. I'm not a massive fan, if I'm completely honest, but we need games like this, and it's going to need a high-profile developer to get them the exposure they deserve. And so I think kudos to Sony and kudos to Kojima for bringing us this game, bringing us something that's really different, and something that we really need, bearing in mind that we are at the tail end of this console generation, and there is a lot of sameness about games, no doubt about it.
Well said, well said. I agree 100%. You're right. Most games these days, like I've said before you even touch the controller, you already know what it is. You can just even lean over somebody's shoulder at a trade show and watch for 5 minutes, and you kind of have you already understand like what this game is, and it's like, oh yeah, I know exactly what this is going to be. And 10 out of 10 times, I'd say, even, it's always right.
A classic case in point here would be the new Modern Warfare, which I think is absolutely brilliant. I mean, it's astonishing, another late-gen technical marvel. But I knew what I was going to be getting going in, and that's not something that, you know, and as I said, the idea of having a game that I just don't understand until I actually go hands-on with it is so rare and precious. So yeah, I'm going to be really looking forward to getting my hands on this one.
Excellent. Well, I think that's going to do it for now, though. So thanks for joining me for this discussion, Rich.
No, it's been fascinating.
And if you guys enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like and subscribe and ring the notification bell for instant updates for Digital Foundry. And of course, follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John and Rich signing off.